Awesome. All right, so I'm Jay Segal. Just wanted to, I'm going to kick this off. So we're all from Vertex, and I think glad to be up here on the stage. And all we're going to do here is give you some information about what we've gone through over the last 5 years implementing MES at Vertex. I think it puts us in a fun position because, I'm not here to sell you anything, just here to, let you know honestly what we've gone through, the ups, the downs, the good, the bad. Vertex, like I said, has been implementing POMSnet Aquila over the last 5 years for our MES system. I don't know where Roland is, but wanted to thank the POMS team and Roland. Roland is our head of sales, and he reached out a few weeks ago and said, hey, we have a presentation spot at Pharma MES, and we wanted to give it to the home team. So if you don't know Vertex, we're a pharmaceutical company. We have multiple locations on the seaport and a couple around the globe, but mainly headquartered in Boston and mainly work out of Boston. So it's good to be here presenting to everybody. My team and we've been implementing MES and other digital solutions for cell and gene therapy. Cell and gene therapy is new, relatively new to the biopharmaceutical world, and it's we've mainly been supporting clinical operations, and there's a lot of challenges for what we go through, and we wanted to kind of share our experiences implementing an MES system in cell and gene therapies as well as in a clinical operation. Sara represents our small molecule business unit, and she's actually has the luxury of supporting a commercial operation, so she's going to tell you a little bit about validating that. Right. Anyway, okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about MES. Emily actually brought up a good question and said, I love how we started this. So I'm going to go a little bit off the script, take 1 minute and just say, she said, most of you probably fell into MES accidentally. And that struck a nerve because I absolutely fell into MES accidentally. I had done an ERP implementation a long time ago and then did a lot of manufacturing and process engineering. And when Vertex they were looking for somebody who knew ERP and digital systems and also knew manufacturing. And so when they came calling, I was interviewing with my boss, who ended up becoming my boss. And I said, no, this is great. So you're implementing MES system? And he said, yes, we are. And I said, well, great. Do you know which one it is? And he said, no, I don't. And I said, well, okay, I got to work for this guy. This guy's awesome. So it's actually, it's been quite a journey, and it's been a lot of fun. Anyway, I also wanted to touch on Angela's point. Do we think that AI is going to, end up taking our jobs? I think AI has been a really cool topic, and it's got a lot of applicability into, it's going to work its way into MES across the board and digital systems across the board. But when I think of it, when I think of my job and what I get to do each day, I actually, on top of the MES team, I also have fallen into supporting automation, our Pi Historian, our Pi Vision system, our automation system, and now automation in general. So when I think of AI taking over my job, there's an age-old question that started in, we started asking ourselves in the 70s and 80s, and it's, I think of Terminator, and I think, what was what happened in the future that made AI so angry at the humans that they tried to take, they said humanity can't continue. And I look at that and I think, when they try to have AI take over my job, that's going to be the singularity. That's going to drive AI to be pretty angry. So with that, want to just move on. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, if for anybody in the room that's thinking about using MES for clinical, or you're just starting your search, A couple things to think about when you're, meeting with prospective companies. One, what's the current customer base, right? Some MES systems in companies are pretty small, and we have some very, very large ones that you can work with as well. A small company, I don't know, POMS is, in that small to medium-sized company. When we have a problem, we call, the head of customer service, Travis, and we tell him what our problem is, and he's setting up a meeting within, that day to start talking through it and getting his team resolving it. Similarly, when we have a conference, they call us directly and say, hey, do you guys want to take our presentation spot? And then, when there's cool new features being created, sometimes we even get a sneak peek at it, and they say, "Hey, can you give us some feedback on it?" That's the kind of the kind of support that you're not going to get at a larger company. What's a larger company going to do? When you need 10 experts in that program and a whole team to get something done in 6 months, yeah, when you have a large company, you'll probably find a much more a very large base to help you support that. It's really what your needs are. Are you do you want local talent that's available to you right away, or do you want do you want to feel like you're part of a family with your MES? So it's a choice. I think we're very happy with our small to medium company. We get a lot of benefit out of it. Similarly, one thing people don't consider is you're going to need an implementation partner. You're not going to be able to implement a system as big as an MES system on your own. So I like to say over the last 4 years, I worked very closely with our implementation partner, EIS, who is also here. They're a great company. And thinking about it, I actually work with a program manager that, as I like to say, we talk on the phone at least 3 to 4 days a week for about an hour. And I just see my wife staring at me thinking, I wish you talk to me like you talk to your implementation manager. And it's true. So, similarly, pick your implementation partner because, yeah, you might have these conversations for they might brighten your day for an hour each day, and your wife or significant other will be very mad at you while you do it. So, similarly, think about when you're picking an MES system or digital system, what skills are needed. You're gonna, eventually when you're post-implementation, you're gonna have to make changes to your system. So you have to ask yourself, what's the authoring like? What's the kind of programming that you have to use? Do you need to know SQL, C#, Python, R, object-based programming? All of those are going to come into play, and you have to think about how you support it. And then finally, are you using other systems? Are you going to implement or integrate to an ERP system? Do you have a PI system, a LIMS system? How are you going to integrate with those systems? Do you want to integrate with those systems? Do you want to use a third party to support the integration to those systems? So these are all the things that I think you need to think about when you're looking for your MES system. And if you start thinking about it early, it's going to make your journey a little bit easier. All right, so with that, that's what I wanted to say. I'm going to turn it over to my team, Connor MacEachern and Justin Gottlieb. I'm just going to apologize in advance. As our presentation made it through our corporate reviews, it got truncated a little, so more of the slides that we're going to develop have actually kind of been shrunk down. So these guys are just sort of going to talk to the lessons learned that they had and kind of expound upon this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Connor and Justin.
Hey guys, I'm Connor, Business Systems Senior Analyst. I'm going to be talking more a bit about lessons learned on the operational side. So as we were implementing MES, so essentially a couple things is end user adoption and also stakeholder engagement and involvement. And then also when you're starting with paper, how are you going to remove that paper and keep the paper off the floor? So that's something that we had worked with, and essentially we got to a point where we removed all of the paper logbooks, we had equipment logbooks in place, and then maybe about 6 to 8 months later, we found out that the operators were back on paper again. So having a process in place to remove the paper and keep the paper out of the suites is going to be huge and very important. Also, implementing the system, it's important to know the system boundaries, so where and what capacity is that system going to be used and where is that system not going to be used. So another instance of maybe we hadn't outlined that strictly enough, so we're kind of facing that push now where we're being asked to maybe add some warehouse equipment that could be in a gray area for MES that maybe shouldn't be logged in MES or stuff like that. So really outlining strictly and defining the boundaries of the MES system is huge as well. Also, in implementing an MES system, it's important to have stakeholder involvement. So your end users, your manufacturing, your QA, really getting their involvement early, setting their management, getting that buy-in from them, that we're going to have participation from manufacturing, what times are needed, and who's going to be involved throughout the process is going to be huge. And also folks along the line that take to the system and the adoption technically very well could serve as like a technical role, so maybe a change champion or a quality trainer. And that's something that maybe we were a little bit slow on, so we're working to right now create a community of change champions and qualified trainers within our system, and then building up that community and strengthening the teams from that way.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Justin, and I'm an MES recipe author. I have about 8 years of experience authoring recipes with PharmSnet. So the first point I'd like to mention is how important flexibility is. When you're dealing with a drug product or any product in clinical trials, the process is always changing, and you don't want to always have to update your recipe for a minor process update. And fortunately, PharmSnet allows the recipe author to configure a lot of flexibility into the recipes. And let me run through a couple examples. So for example, right now you might have an operator using one filter for their filtration process. Next week it could be 2. And the next week, filtration might be eliminated from the process. So in order to keep the recipe the same, you might want to just remove the tolerance from how many filters you record and allow the operator to record as many filters as they need. Taking it to the next step, you might want to allow an operator to record a material that's not even on your BOM right now. And another example of how you could implement some flexibility, you might have a couple unit procedures where today you execute one unit procedure first and the second one second. Next week it could be vice versa. So you don't want an operator running into an error where they can't initiate a unit procedure because the previous one wasn't completed yet. So we have some recipes where a bunch of unit procedures might be in parallel and they could be started whenever the operator needs to start them. So building in flexibility wherever you can is a strong recommendation from us. The next point I'd like to talk about is planning ahead for go-live support. Of course, development is extremely important, but you can't forget about supporting when you go live. You need to think about what areas and shifts you have to support. How will you reconcile your ERP and MES system? And as mentioned earlier by the Merck presentation, system upgrades are huge. They could take months, 3-4 months. You need to think about a process for how will you implement these system upgrades. Finally, the last point I'd like to mention before I turn it over to Sara is validation. You want to have an efficient and quick validation approach that accurately implements your updates and new recipes, especially for when you're in clinical trials. There will be updates being requested all the time, and you want to implement these quickly and efficiently. If someone asks for a simple update, You don't want it to take 8 to 10 weeks to implement. You want to implement it as soon as possible. And I'll turn it over to Sara to talk more about validation.
Hi, I'm Sara Waggener. I'm the business owner for small molecule MES. So when you're doing your validation, it consists of your system validation and your workflow validation. One of the ways to ensure that your workflow validation goes really well is to have a robust system validation process. Oftentimes you can leverage your vendors out of the box validation packages and just do a minimum amount of testing based on your own user requirements and functional requirements. Most of this talk is going to cover the workflow validation because for us, that's what's taking the most amount of time and limiting us getting through there. So we define our business workflow requirements and we test them with user acceptance testing. We've gone with a templated approach, so if we have processes that are similar but might just have a variant for a different product, maybe the bill of materials is different, but the process is the same. We leverage a template-based process, and we don't actually have to do a full UAT testing on that recipe. And then we also leverage generic workflows for things like room and equipment usage, room and equipment cleaning, equipment standardization, things that are across all of our products. Our current process was to take a source document like a paper batch record or a logbook and make our MES workflow using that, do some iterations, testing based on the feedback. Then we would define our requirements based on the finalized workflow, and then all of the functionality was tested step by step. So these were really long UATs because each little step that you do in your MES was tested individually. This resulted in many, many hours of work, hundreds of pages of documentation produced, evidence attached to every test step, a lot of management and review of that process. So we thought, well, this is what's holding us up from really quickly testing. Is there a better way to deliver the same output while still producing the same quality with less effort? Because we don't want to make it faster, but sacrifice quality at the same time. So the guidance from the industry has recently shifted away from a computer system validation strategy more towards a computer software assurance strategy. So ISP came out with their guidance in 2024. The FDA came out with a proposed guidance and finalized their guidance just last month. So both of these direct you to do a risk-based approach. So a comparison of the two validation strategies. So when you're doing CSV, it's formalized, it's heavily documented, you're using highly scripted testing, things like click this button, ensure that that performs in this way, attach evidence. Focus is providing evidence of compliance throughout. It's really time prohibitive, labor intensive for the tester. When we move to a computer system assurance strategy, it's risk-based approach. So you're looking at all of the things, elements of your process, of your workflow, and saying, is this a risky thing? Do we think something is going to go wrong with this step? And then we're doing unscripted testing for anything that's on low risk. We're not eliminating testing, we're just not prescribing that in a very scripted manner. We do some targeted testing for things that are high risk. So those steps might have very specific scripted testing. They might require you to attach evidence that it did complete correctly. But it does rely heavily on subject matter experts to do your testing because they're not being prompted, click this button, click that button. They need to understand the process of the workflow when they're doing their testing. So the way we've been going about doing this is we develop a user story, which is part of our pre-work. That user story then translates into our business workflow requirements. And in this way, instead of taking our workflow and making our requirements based on our workflow, we're making our requirements based on what our users, our process development folks, our commercialization folks say, hey, this is what I do in the process. Those elements go into the development of the workflow. So we're developing it based on the user story, which means we're not necessarily following step-by-step paper batch record. We're actually looking at the process from what do the users say they need, and you can eliminate unnecessary steps. We then also do a functional risk assessment. So we say every requirement, what could go wrong? Is it going to go wrong? Could somebody detect that? And we rank those, and we come out with a risk score for that requirement. And that determines our validation strategy, whether we do just unscripted testing for that requirement, or we have a very specific test script line that says, you must test this, this is what it must come out as. By doing this, we significantly reduce the documentation required. So we're just attaching evidence of execution of the test rather than step-by-step screenshots. It's all risk-based, so you have that justification that you can provide an inspector that comes, an auditor, and say, hey, we assessed these, we did all our testing, and we found that these things are unlikely to be a problem, or if there was a problem, we have a workaround that could, an exception process or something like that could work around. And then it also reduced our non-system related defects, so test script errors, typos, somebody forgot to attach a screenshot that turns out to not be that important. Those types of defects are essentially completely eliminated because you don't have nearly as much text. It doesn't actually have as much human error involved. And throughout the process, we're involving the business owner, the recipe authors, specifically QA. QA is very much involved in this process. They're actually much more involved in our CSA approach than they were in our CSV approach, and our validation team. So here's a case study. So we've been on our MES journey for 5 years now. We've been doing stage implementation. So we started with a very small record that just did materials management. Then we did a record with materials management and equipment management. And that was the one that we did with our CSV strategy. So we had a base record, and then we were switching back and forth to the paper record for process execution. When we started adding process execution, we realized this is going to be huge. If we test every single step by step, and provide documentation evidence, we're never going to get through this. So the recipe that we tested under CSV had a relatively small number of process steps. When we went to the next iteration of that recipe, we increased the number of process steps by 775%. So just that recipe is significantly more complicated. But by using the user story rather than the workflow to define our requirements, we were able to decrease the number of essential requirements by 95%. We were able to decrease the number of test steps in our test scripts by using unscripted testing by 96%. And then the actual testing time was decreased by 50%. So we were able to significantly decrease the testing burden, even though the workflow that we were testing was significantly more complicated than the original one that we did with the CSV strategy. We also had very few testing defects in each case, and we didn't encounter any post-slide issues during execution. I do have a very small note that there was one thing we needed to fix, but we didn't find it through execution. We found it through further review of a different workflow that used the same process. So we're still maintaining our compliance here. We're not, going live with a recipe that, hasn't been validated or has a lot of defects. So we're not finding that we're missing defects by going to this strategy, and this is the strategy that we're moving forward for our MES in order to move faster. So if you change a small thing in a step name or something like that, in our previous process, we would have to update our test script and get all of that approved, versus in this case, you can still run that same unscripted testing because you know that somebody knows how to test that, and it doesn't matter what that phase name is named. So that's pretty much it for our case study. Just overall, our experience is that throughout the process, including validation, that stakeholder engagement and flexibility are one of the most crucial parts of the process. We needed to properly plan starting at vendor selection all the way through implementation and go live support. And then efficient validation and support of the validation are keys to our success for continuing. I have a lot of thank yous. I actually ran out of space on my slide for groups that contributed to this. So all of the groups that use MES, that use the process, that approve the process, they all contributed to our journey and through our validation. So I think I left time for questions.
Yeah.
Nailed it 8 seconds ago.